Bienvenidos to the Paseo podcast. I am your host, Joshua Smyser-DeLeon. I am joined today by Marisol LeBrón. She is an associate professor in feminist studies and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California, Santa Cruz. She is author of Against Puerto Rico, Lessons from the Verano Boricua and Policing Life and Death, Race, Violence, and Resistance in Puerto Rico. Second guest we have today is Sarah Molinari. She is an anthropologist and postdoctoral research associate at Florida International University. Her research focuses on the lived experiences of debt and disaster recovery processes in Puerto Rico. Ooh, that was a mouthful, y'all. Marisol, Sarah, welcome to the Paseo podcast. How are you both today?
Good. Thanks for having us, Joshua.
Really appreciate you both being here. You're also, I should mention, the co-creators of the Puerto Rico Syllabus. Sarah, can you say a little bit about what PR Syllabus is? And Marisol, can you share a little bit about what the Puerto Rican Studies Association is? Sarah, why don't we start with you?
Sure. So the Puerto Rico Syllabus is a digital resource that was launched in 2017. I'm one of the co-founders along with Marisol, Yarimar Bonilla, and Isabel Gusardo. And it emerges and draws inspiration from trends in hashtag syllabi, public syllabi, and other forms of intellectual community building that center collaboration and social scholarship. And what the syllabus does is it curates and archives bilingual sources from various points of entry about the overlapping crises in Puerto Rico to help folks from wide audiences and entry points understand what's happening. And what we wanted to do with the syllabus was complicate a lot of the mainstream narratives around Puerto Rico's debt that were emphasizing, right, especially back in 2016, 2017, a very victim-blaming narrative, economistic narrative surrounding the debt crisis, and also U.S. benevolence in stating a legal framework to solve the debt crisis. So in this context, we wanted to provide historical and other kinds of social resources for a deeper understanding of the crisis, and also to highlight activist responses and have the syllabus serve as a kind of guide for self-study, but also as a call to action.
Marisol, Puerto Rican Studies Association, what should we know about that?
We are the Association for Puerto Rican Scholars. So, the way we kind of define that, right, is folks who are working on Puerto Rico or Puerto Ricans, right? So we are diaspora and archipelago inclusive. We focus on both. We encourage scholarship on both, and we encourage the exchange between scholars working in both of those contexts. And we really try to center on mentoring, like junior scholars, creating opportunities for discussion, really trying to push the field in particular ways, right? Highlight narratives that fall out of the dominant framework, right? So at least with Puerto Rico Syllabus, we're very interested in challenging this overly economistic idea of the debt, highlighting the ways in which debt falls unevenly on certain marginalized populations. We're also really dedicated to trying to really interrogate silences in the field, right? And definitely for the past year, we've been doing a really intense push around discussions of anti-Blackness within Puerto Rican communities, both in the diaspora and the archipelago, and trying to address that, the way in which that, pops up in our scholarship, right? The way in which our scholarship can sometimes reproduce these super nationalist narratives about, Puerto Rico as a kind of racial democracy, right? Or really downplay the centrality of Black intellectual production and thought and Black people to Puerto Rican studies, right? So that's something that we've been really dedicated in the past year to really like amplifying the scholarship of our colleagues that is dealing with those themes in response to what we felt like was a kind of reproduction of some of these silences. And then, so our big things are we do these biennial symposia and conferences, and our conference is coming up this year in October in Holyoke. So stay tuned for more details about that. And we're working on the theme right now, the call for papers, and it's going to be really amazing. And we're really, really excited about it.
Can you all just tell us if people want to learn more about PR Syllabus or the Puerto Rican Studies Association, how would they be able to do that?
Both are on Twitter, Instagram, all of that, Facebook. So for Puerto Rican Studies Association, you can find us at Rican Studies on Instagram and Twitter. We also have a group on Facebook if you search Puerto Rican Studies Association.
PuertoRicoSyllabus.com as well, and also use hashtag PR Syllabus to kind of get involved with hashtag conversations on social media as well.
Love it. Moving on though, y'all wrote an op-ed in Truthout. The article was called "New Puerto Rico Debt Plan is a False, quote unquote, solution crafted to benefit capitalists." Now, when I saw this in my Google alerts, I was immediately hooked. I said, let me open this up. Marisol, I know you and I are Twitter buddies. You know, we've shared some DMs before. So tied the name to the article, read through it. Great piece. We'll link it in the show notes if anybody wants to read it over. Some of the points you made in the article I thought really stood out to me that we haven't talked about on the show before. Now, people that have listened to our episodes know we are no strangers to talking about the new debt restructuring plan. And as I was telling you both, Marisol and Sarah, before we recorded, we had people on when the plan was being debated before it was officially approved. We've shared panel discussions of people kind of reacting to what this debt restructuring plan means. So just to kind of bring people up to speed, and both of you feel free to keep me honest here, I'm just going to run through some high level details just for people that maybe haven't listened to past episodes. So the new debt restructuring plan was passed on January 18th. Judge Taylor Swain of New York Southern District Court confirmed Puerto Rico's 8th amended plan of adjustment, or POA. The plan is the largest municipal debt restructuring deal in the history of the United States. And the Fiscal Control Board, or La Junta, has noted that the plan reduces claims against the government from $33 billion to just over $7.4 billion. I want to stop there. Because I would love Marisol or Sarah, whoever wants to jump in here. I would love for y'all to share what the pros and cons of this plan are, and share a little bit about how Puerto Ricans on the island have reacted. Because if you listen to the Fiscal Control Board, it's all like gumdrops and rainbows and butterflies. Like, this is the best thing since sliced bread. But it sounds like when you talk to Puerto Ricans on the island and the surrounding islands, it's a much different story. So what are the pros and cons of this plan?
Yeah, I mean, I think your characterization of it as this, it's been touted as this kind of amazing solution to Puerto Rico's debt crisis. The reduction is substantial, right, from 33 to 7. But, I think what's missing in that is a larger conversation about the legality of the debt in the first place, right? Whether that debt should even be repaid, how it was generated, all of those. What it does is reinscribe the idea that this is an actual debt that Puerto Ricans owe, right? And I think that's what, in our Truthout piece, we really took issue with, this idea of reifying the debt, right? This makes the debt real. It precludes many opportunities for an audit and abolition of not only portions of the debt, but and many activists would argue the entire debt has been illegally generated, or that it's operates under onerous conditions, right? So therefore should not be paid back. And so for us, this was the main problem, right? So the pro, when you hear from kind of Wall Street and La Junta, is that that's not happening, right? That's the pro for them, is that, they bought this debt for especially vulture kind of financiers, right? They bought this debt for pennies on the dollar, right? So they're actually making money off of this plan. And even in the cut of the debt, and Sarah knows much more about this, so I'll let her speak to this, but even in cutting the debt, there's still a massive payout that's included in this, is not really getting discussed in many of these pieces about the plan of adjustment. So I'll let Sarah jump in there.
Yeah, I would say that this is one of the cons, and certainly the way I think that the public has been misled by the media and by the control board and by certain government figures about this. Because yes, right, this is a significant cut. It's kind of promoted as an 80% cut in general obligation debt and certain other streams of Puerto Rico's public debt. But exactly like Marisol said, that's not taking account for a $7 billion cash payout that is going directly to certain bondholders, this month in March. So I think an important question is, what could Puerto Rico do and invest in for the public, for public infrastructure, for people's health, for climate resiliency, that is foreclosed based on this cash payment, based on the 25 years that this plan confines Puerto Ricans to repay the debt. So not only how the public is misled in terms of the 80% cut, but there's not a lot of discussion about the kinds of creditors who are benefiting more than others, right? Because there's a lot of different creditor streams and bondholders involved in this, plan of adjustment. And the ones who actually are experiencing the most severe, what's called a haircut, right, in this terminology, are the small time creditors, a lot of the Puerto Rican creditors, a lot of folks that had different kind of claims against the government, right? Small time claims. So the ones who were not experiencing the most, significant haircuts are actually the vulture fund, bondholders.
I do find that interesting that of all the vulture funds or all the loan companies to give back money to, they're deciding to prioritize those in the States as opposed to those on the island. So even in this bad scenario, it's still worse off for Puerto Rican owned businesses.
Yeah. And working people. And, there's even clauses within the plan that provide for more debt payments through what's called a contingent value instrument. So if the Puerto Rican economy improves by certain metrics, the plan sets up additional payments to certain bondholders. Again, these are the hedge fund bondholders themselves. So there's all kinds of these tricks, right, within the plan that lie, kind of unseen by the media narrative that it's an 80% cut.
Sounds like the plan is built where the goalpost is moved. It's baked in that it's just going to move dependent on the economic success of Puerto Rico. So current state, we're on track to pay this amount. But if Puerto Rico makes some miraculous turnaround and is able to get some sort of income into the economy to invest in things like clean energy, to invest in education, to safeguard pension funds, like even if it gets to that point where it is becoming more economically viable, that positive ends up turning into a negative because that money that the effort that they're putting into being more economically sustainable is just ultimately going to be siphoned from in order to pay back more of this debt. Am I understanding that correctly? Okay.
Yeah, I think that's a great summary. Yes.
Okay.
I was just going to say too, I think, the important thing that, I think Sarah's comments point us to is to actually think like not just about the plan of adjustment, but that all of the phases of La Junta under Promesa have been geared towards paying back these hedge funds and vulture funds, right? And so even if we look at something like COFINA, right, the division between senior and junior bondholders within COFINA dictates that Puerto Rican pensioners and other folks with claims that are entitled to certain repayments by the Puerto Rican government, certain bondholders, they're at a lesser status than these international hedge funds and US-based vulture funds. That it's already baked into so many different elements of the repayment from the beginning that Wall Street was going to be privileged, right? And I think we're having two different conversations, which one, we need to kind of have this conversation about the inequalities with the repayment at the same time that we're also having the conversation with the debt shouldn't be repaid in the first place, right? Mm-hmm. Because the debt was generated under kind of dubious circumstances, right? And so, we can kind of critique the way that the repayment is now moving forward and the kind of way in which it's set up to privilege, once again, folks that have been benefiting from the beginning, which are these vulture funds, these hedge funds, right? The money is largely leaving Puerto Rico, right, rather than staying. But we have to always keep in mind that with the debt, the problem is always that it's being siphoned off, right? Mm-hmm. The debt is automatically, even under the best of circumstances, siphoning off essential money for public good that could benefit Puerto Ricans. Where that money is being siphoned off from most, commonly is going to be from the public good, right? It's going to be things like education. It's going to be things like healthcare. It's going to be things like assistance payments, all of that kind of stuff, right? And, we can talk about the big kind of bomb with this, right, was the concern about the pensions, right? And there's certain protections for the pensions, but it's not complete, right? There's still a kind of danger happening for pensioners, which is another vulnerable population. So that we have to always keep in mind that tension, right, between the kind of inequality baked into the repayment schemes put out by La Junta at the same time that we need to be like, why is this being repaid in the first place?
I think that's a great point. And I appreciate you saying that, because I think it's spot on. A lot of media has been focused on this debt restructuring plan, but not enough writing or reporting has been done on how this debt came to be to begin with. You had mentioned, Marisol, that this debt has not been audited. We've talked about that on the show before, but would love to hear your explanation on why this debt has yet to be audited. What are some of the obstacles to preventing this from happening?
So I'm going to punt that question to Sarah, because that is exactly her work. If I could just say one thing about something you said, Joshua, mm-hmm. because I think it's really important for us to keep in mind, right, is, you asked a question about like how the debt was generated. And I think it's really important for us to think about the way that this debt has been generated. Like, this is not the past 5 years. This is not the past 10 years. This has been decades in the making, right? This is stuff that has to do with the failure of the ELA and the Commonwealth arrangement and all of the development schemes that fell under that umbrella, and the failure of a new development model to take root, right? The after kind of the petrochemical failure in the 80s, right? And the kind of, there's been all of these attempts to, peg the Puerto Rican economy to a certain kind of industry that have not taken root, right? And what that's created is this vacuum where debt filled the hole, right? The Puerto Rican government was forced, because of the Commonwealth arrangement, the colonial relationship between the U.S. and Puerto Rico, and the failure of this development model to just rely on debt for the essential functioning of the state, right? And so this is the thing that we have to keep in mind, is this is not just something that's like, oh, Puerto Ricans don't know. Like, we talk about it as if it's like your grandma, right? Your grandma can't, balance her checkbook, right? Like, we're not talking about it like that. This is not like Puerto Ricans overspent and they didn't budget. This is the Commonwealth arrangement, the colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico denied certain mechanisms for the Puerto Rican government to dictate its own economic fate, and as a result constricted the options available to it, right? Where the option for keeping the state going, for paying pensions, for paying salaries, for doing infrastructural projects, which it, as we know from Hurricane Maria, was not able to keep up, right? But even for those bare essential services, they had to rely on debt, right? And we can talk about corruption being a part of that, right? Not everything went to the public good, right? There was funds that were diverted, but overwhelmingly, right, this is about a failure of an economic model based in colonialism that starved the state of financial resources, right? And that made debt the only way of accessing funds. Sarah, I'll let you explain it, because I know you do a beautiful job.
Yeah, just to segue, because I agree with what you, Joshua, and Marisol have been saying, and the story, right, of Puerto Rico's indebting is a story of how racial colonial capitalism was operationalized in Puerto Rico, right, throughout the 20th century and 21st century. And it's also a story about how the U.S. municipal bond market reproduces and functions through racialized geographies of debt. So it's no accident that Puerto Rico, is where the largest municipal bankruptcy has happened in the United States. So I think that the criticism from folks, concerned about the fact that the debt has not been audited it's really a moral question, because this restructuring bill was pushed through without the kind of full story being told, revealed, investigated, even though multiple investigations done from different academic organizations, activist groups, right? There's a Comisión Ciudadana, there's a citizen commission to audit the debt. There was a public audit commission to audit the debt formed in 2016 that former Governor Paseo dismantled in 2017, right? All of these different sources have, since 2016, been finding and calling attention to illegalities and unconstitutional parts of the debt, certain debt emissions that they were flagging, right? The question of access to information has been really interesting here because Rosselló, part of his argument for dismantling the public audit commission in 2017 was that there wasn't enough money for it, right? Which is interesting.
The irony. Because, sorry, go ahead.
Right. This bankruptcy process, as of now, has cost Puerto Ricans $1 billion. So the purpose of an audit, which is a pretty kind of democratic liberal tool, right? It's actually the demand for an audit in itself works within or could work within an existing legal framework to discover and investigate different debt emissions over time, how the debt was accumulated, and then what happened right in that process. What was the debt used for? So I think that this is a moral question as well. And the control board itself has kind of made various gestures since 2018, I believe, to publish reports that cost millions of dollars. Interestingly, not enough money for the public audit commission, but the control board can hire its own consulting firm and folks to do a kind of investigative report that does not find any banks, individuals, underwriters actually accountable and does not name names. So they have tried to do these gestures and say that, yes, the debt has been audited, but that is drastically different from what the activists demand, especially from the Frente Ciudadano por la Auditoría de la Deuda has been saying for years now, right? They want a comprehensive citizen audit, right? Because these institutional lines are not, people can't have confidence in them that the debt will actually be seriously audited. And people often make this analogy that's very simple, but it makes a lot of sense, right? Like you go to a restaurant and you get a bill and it's like leaving a restaurant and leaving your credit card without looking at what you're paying for, right? It's as simple as that. So the problem, again, with the plan of adjustment is that it forecloses the possibility of an audit. It also endorses and legitimizes debt that the control board itself has found to be illegal, $6 billion. So this is really astounding. And of course, people are very upset about it because what an audit could have perhaps done, right? And this is within the frame of debt payment, which again, I agree with Marisol's point that we have to also talk about basically the legitimacy question, the debt legitimacy question as well at the same time. But an audit could have drastically reduced the amount that is in this debt restructuring plan right now and the lines of payments that Puerto Ricans have to now pay for the next 25 years.
It's just so weird to see, at least here in the States, the conversation being, this is a great resolution. Like this debt plan is going to be the best thing for Puerto Rico. And it's all based off debt projections. And like we said, and the deeper I don't want to get off track, but the deeper we get into it, it's like, this is not really a resolution. Like this is barely even a deal. Because I'm a cancel the debt type person. I'm like, cancel my student loan debt, cancel Puerto Rico's debt, cancel it all. That's where my mind goes. Hola, Joshua Smyser-DeLeon here, founder and host of the Paseo podcast. Thanks for listening to the show, where we highlight stories by, from, and about the Puerto Rican community, from La Isla to the diaspora. If you want to help us share the diverse and vibrant stories that make up the Puerto Rican communities here on Paseo, Boricua, and Chicago, and around the world, subscribe to our podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you stream your podcasts. Subscribing helps more people find the show and will help you make sure you never miss an episode. Leaving a 5-star rating and showing some love in the comments helps too. You can also give a donation by looking up the Paseo podcast on savechicagomedia.org. Okay, that's enough from me. Enjoy the show. Marisol, Sarah, really appreciate you being on the show. I have a couple of last questions before we wrap up. At the end of every show, one of our questions to our guests is, what does being Puerto Rican mean to you? Now, Sarah, I know you're not Boricua, but you're welcome to the Boricua barbecue. I think anybody listening would know you have more than earned your stripes trying to advocate for Puerto Rico, for what's best for Puerto Rican people. So Marisol, I know it's a loaded question, but would love to hear from your own personal perspective. What does being Puerto Rican mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, it's a tough question. So, I mean, I'm also, diaspora Puerto Rican. I grew up in the Bronx and, I was one of those kids that, spent summers in Puerto Rico and stuff like that. And so, for me, I think with kind of like my background and positionality and stuff like that, like the diaspora is central to, Puerto Rican identity, right? I think that for me, that's part of what I try to do in my work, right? And how I think about like how I approach my own work, right? It's so much around trying to bridge, I think, that gap between the diaspora and the archipelago, and this kind of, there's a little bit of mutual suspicion, right? On both sides. I think a lot of diaspora Puerto Ricans feel that feeling of, not being Puerto Rican enough, or having their Puerto Ricanness questioned, or, all of that kind of stuff, this feeling of shame and anxiety, right? That this kind of diasporic, positionality can generate, even though when you're in the diaspora, you feel really Puerto Rican, right? And you're in this like very Puerto Rican kind of, setting and milieu, right? And then on the other hand, frustration that a lot of archipelago Puerto Ricans rightfully have with those of us in the diaspora sometimes that, get a lot more access and attention around issues that actually are affecting them, right? And so, I think for me in the work that I try to do is to really, I think work in collaboration with folks in the archipelago, right? To, I think, approach that and listen to folks and, try to amplify that in the way that makes the most sense, right? And the way that I have access to, which is through kind of like my academic work and stuff like that. So that's definitely like how I approach these kind of, questions. And, the other thing is, to be Puerto Rican is to really be supreme in the realm of memes, I feel like. And I think we should own that. So I feel good about that. So.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. Gotta love the PR memes.
I love it. All right, Sarah, what about you? What does being a Puerto Rican ally mean to you?
Well, first, I will come to the Boricua barbecue any day. Happy to be invited. Yeah, I mean, I enter these conversations and position myself as a white ally or a white person in solidarity with Puerto Rican work and Puerto Rican struggle. My connection to Puerto Rico is kind of a variety of affective, scholarly, and activist, affinities. I'm not Puerto Rican myself. My family background is, Italian, but I did grow up with a Puerto Rican step family, and I began to get active with organizing for Puerto Rico, especially around Vieques and environmental questions in New York. Over a decade ago, so starting around like 2010. At the time I was studying Latin American and Latino studies at Fordham. I had a professor, Clara Rodriguez, who's a Puerto Rican sociologist, who really kind of shaped my intellectual trajectory. Looking back now, I kind kind of see it all, put it all together. But coming out of Fordham and coming out of her class, I made a connection at the Center for Puerto Rican Studies, and that's where I ended up working for the 4 years after my bachelor's degree. And I was doing oral history work and kind of really getting more interested in research, right? In research questions related to Puerto Rico. So I decided to pursue a PhD, kind of continuing my some of these questions right in Puerto Rico, and that's where I've kind of dedicated my research time, but also a lot of my like activist and advocacy connections to. And it's one of the reasons that I think collaboration is very central to my work, as well as a more activist anthropology orientation. So
before we sign off, how can people stay up to date with you?
I'm on Twitter way more than I should be, so you can find me on Twitter at Marisol LeBrón.
Same here. Also, find me on Twitter at Sarah Molinari. And a lot of my publications are, there's a link to my website. A lot of my publications are also available publicly. So,
okay. And definitely go check out their op-ed in Truthout. New Puerto Rico debt plan is a false solution crafted to benefit capitalists. It is well worth your time. Marisol LeBrón, Sarah Molinari, thanks again for being on the show.
Thanks so much, Joshua.
Thanks, Joshua.